right. So where we left off last time, we were talking about, I forgot to plug in my fancy microphone. We had talked about a lot of elements within the film, and now we need to spend a little bit of time specifically talking about issues related to gender and sexuality. And in some ways, in film and in media in general, depression tends to be a very gendered disorder, especially in the way it's presented in movies. And The Hours is kind of one of those. The way Cunningham wrote the novel, the way Cunningham wrote for the film, you see some elements of his approach that are very gendered and very specific to the lives of women. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it is what it is. He's kind of putting out there what would have been the reality in Virginia Woolf's world for how womanhood and femininity are defined, and what are some ways that that thread has been pulled forward through these other women's lives through the 50s and into the 90s. So he's kind of taking you on that little journey of what does it mean to have certain expectations and assumptions about how women's lives are to be constructed. And then for us in this class, we have to think about how does that then link up with how we expect women to behave, what do we expect them to feel, and in what ways does just the fact of their lives make them more vulnerable to depressive illness. So that's kind of where we need to go. And one of the things that is pretty clear in many films that take us in the direction of looking at women's experiences of depression is that there's a little bit of a Freudian kind of psychoanalytic thread. My opinion, it's strictly my opinion, since Cunningham, the author of the novel and the writer of the film, was attempting to pull that kind of Virginia Woolf reality through the lives of the other two women. Virginia Woolf, she was raised as a person, as a child, in the heyday of Freudian psychology, just the absolute peak of it. So she probably had her fill during hospitalizations of psychoanalytic nonsense about women and women's sexuality, since she herself was fairly, we would say today, fairly gender fluid. She was also bisexual. She probably got a lot of messages in her own experiences of being told that her sexuality was not normal and was not accepted. So my guess is, purely my guess, is that Cunningham wanted you to hear that message through the stories of these three women. So what you have in all three, in Virginia Woolf, the sexual issues aren't so explicit. There's some assumption that you have some knowledge of Woolf's story. In the other two women, though, they're presented to you as, in the case of Laura, obviously she's married, she's in a heterosexual marriage, but she clearly has attractions to women. And her ultimate decision to leave that marriage was she wanted to pursue relationships with women, right? So, and then you go into the 90s relationship, and Clarissa, she's in a gay relationship, but she's clearly had relationships of other kinds in the past. So there's kind of this thematic element of how does the world deal with women whose sexuality isn't perceived to be normal. So for us, coming back into the movies and madness world, what does that communicate? Partly it suggests that women who are experiencing these negative psychological symptoms, possibly it could be because they're sexually confused, or perhaps they are sexually confused because they have a weak mind. So one of the stereotypes that we're going to explore in the second half of class is going to be that one, that depression is a sign of mental weakness. And in some films, I have noticed that when you're talking about women's lives and women's experiences of depression, it tends to be very internal. It tends to be about something in them that is broken. When stories about men's lives feature depression, it tends to be something in their life went wrong. Like they lost a relationship, they were injured, they lost their job or whatever. It's external factors in their lives. Like even in this film, for Richard, he's profoundly depressed because he's dying, and he's dying in a really ugly way, right? Even though you could make the extrapolation that, he's lived a gay lifestyle, that puts him at risk. You could make that jump to saying it's who he is that has caused his depression. Stereotype-wise, we are far more comfortable making the leap that it's something about the internality of women that makes them prone to depression. But for men, we tend to center their depressive symptoms in situational causes. I would argue that both are problematic. So the assumption that women are depressed because they're women is a problem. It doesn't mean that their situations can't make them experience sadness, and sadness that is pathological. Same for men. It doesn't mean that it's just their situations. It could be that they're experiencing biologically driven depressive symptoms. It could be trauma. It could be that their situations suck, right? So for both, you have a tendency to make some attributions about the causes of depression that are problematic. As many of you noted before, on Monday, this theme of being trapped in roles and being trapped in one's life is pretty strong throughout the entire film. Now, I also asked you in your discussion, your reflection questions, to think about the impacts of depression and mental illness in general on families. And we'll see this more than once, in several of the films that we watch. Clearly, there will be impacts on people's relationships, on their intimate relationships, whether it's marriages or dating relationships. There will be impacts there. And there will be multiple points in time where we will talk specifically about how do families cope with, whether you're talking about partners, parents, siblings, children, how do they cope with an individual with a mental illness? What's dangerous in film is we have a tendency, especially with suicidal depression, to romanticize the note, the letter that's left behind. And that's a real profound part of this film. It shows up more than once in the film. It is a part of the historical record. So it's used here. It's poignant. It's in some ways heartbreakingly beautiful. And in other ways, it's just really painfully straightforward. But it is romanticized. It's beautified in a way, if I can make up a word there. So it starts the film, it connects back to it, and it's also threaded through all three women's lives. So at one point, Clarissa is having this thought that her relationship with Richard was the happiest she'd ever been. And that's a line echoed from the suicide letter that Virginia Woolf leaves. So there's these threads of romanticization of the note, which kind of flies in the face of the fact that for the vast majority of completed suicides, there is no note. There is no lingering leftover explanation for people to have. So it's sort of a misguided expectation that you're going to see that. Now, on the side of accuracy, particularly with Virginia Woolf's story in the movie, the depiction of her husband, Leonard, he is shown just desperately trying to save his wife's life. And if you know anything about Virginia Woolf's life, this was an ongoing struggle for someone who was deeply committed to his partner. And it is a real accurate part of the film, just showing how you're constantly playing catch up, trying to get ahead of symptoms, trying to predict what's going to keep your family members safe and happy. And then, the ultimate horror if those actions don't keep that person safe. And those are issues we're going to explore further when you do your QPR training next week. So I'm going to leave that there. Now, finally, before we move on and we talk about stereotypes related to depression and suicidality, I asked you the reflection question to think about how you have these very poignant statements that Virginia and Richard are making about the degree to which they are suffering and the degree to which they deserve to have autonomy in deciding how to experience the world within that suffering. That's a really common conversation. So if you're talking about real things that people who experience depressive illness might say to themselves or to other people who care for them a great deal, it's things like that there is great pain, and there's simultaneously often great awareness of the depth and the magnitude of that pain. And then there's the cognitive distortion of seeing that pain as being permanent and inescapable, if you follow my logic. And, part of me, I personally relate to this. I was diagnosed with depressive illness in my 20s. So I've had like 35 years of experience. Therapy was very helpful, very useful for me. So it's all good there. But one of the things that I learned was that when you're in the midst of a depressive episode, you can feel it, you can describe it, you can explain it, but what you can't see is the door that leads out of it. So that kind of myopic vision is what was reflected to me in both of their statements. They're honest. The double-edged sword, though, as the viewer, what you might hear is that they're right? So you hear their statements, they're passionate, they are persuasive. And for many, when they hear that, they might say, especially with Richard's situation, he's sick and he's dying. You can see his decision as very, very rational. For Virginia, maybe not so much, right? Or for Laura, who's considering suicide. So the stereotype becomes, if someone wants to die, you cannot stop them. You cannot interrupt that. They have reasons, they're in their head, and in some ways those reasons make sense. So when we have media representations that kind of amp up the reasonableness of someone's argument about their own depressive state or their suicidal thoughts, that can be problematic, right? How many of you are familiar with 13 Reasons Why? Figured most of you are, yeah. 13 Reasons Why was among mental health advocates. They were not happy with it. Not at all. And here's why. Even just the title, it says to the audience, it says to the viewers, if someone I know dies by suicide or someone I know is deeply depressed, there has to be a reason why, and it has to be situational, particularly for adolescents. So there's an over-focus on bullying. There's an over-focus on these interpersonal factors, which they may predict distress, but they're not particularly useful as predictors of suicide. So for mental health advocates, they did not like that series. They advocated getting it pulled from Netflix. The only success they had was to get a warning and a series of follow-up videos that were supposed to be tacked on to the end, that most people, when they're reviewing it, just skipped, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at here, is when the viewer, in the hours, it's supplied to you very subtly. In 13 Reasons Why, it basically is just the whole series. It puts out for you, here's what happens when people are treated like dirt, when they're treated like they're expendable, There are going to be reasons and there are going to be consequences. And the whole goal of the series is to try and punish the people who were the cause, or to make them suffer in some way, or maybe to get them to come to their senses and realize their guilt, right? Those sorts of things. In real life, there often are not reasons, right? And we would rather, as human beings, we'd rather there be reasons that are tangible, that can be, you can get your hands around and that you can understand. All right. I doubt that you'll be able to read that, but now I want to shift gears. I want to talk stereotypes and assumptions and beliefs. I know a couple of you are doing your disorder presentations Friday. Who are my people? Okay, you too. So I'm going to try very hard not to jump on things that you're going to present on Friday. I think you have major depression. Yours is persistent. Yeah. So we're going to look at kind of the depression dimensions of it and levels of severity. Depression in many ways, I used to think this made sense and it was a good thing, but in more recent years I've started to feel like that's not a good thing at all. Depression is often called the common cold of mental illness because it's so prevalent. The prevalence rates are pretty high. A significant percentage of the population at some point in their life would meet the clinical criteria for a depressive episode. So some have said, yeah, it's so common, we'll just equate it with the common cold. Here's the tricky problem about doing that. Common cold, it's common. It doesn't kill you most of the time. People suffer through it and they get over it, right? So calling it equating depression with the common cold, while it may equate in terms of prevalence, it's not a good analogy because depression doesn't work the way the common cold does. So we need to start exploring, why do we try to make these equivalencies between depression and other kinds of more directly biologically based experiences. So before I click and start making a list for you, what do you think some of the stereotypes are about depression? Yeah.
One of them is just the fact that they can just get over it, essentially.
Yeah. That whole word "just" is an issue, isn't it? Just get more exercise, just get more sleep, just get over it.
That people fake it for attention.
Attention seeking is a real powerful stereotype, and we'll see that with bipolar, with all of the other disorders that we look at from here on out. There will be that stereotype.
They have some form of trauma.
Yeah, that goes hand in hand with the attention seeking. Yeah. Yeah. There is a tendency to perceive people with depression as just not, either intentionally or through simple laziness. Thanks. Either being too lazy to do anything about it or too resistant to do anything about it. So just a refusal to take steps that are necessary. Please don't vomit in class, because that would be really gross. One of the reasons I prefer dogs to cats, less people. Other stereotypes that you can think of? What about what kind of messages about depression have you encountered on social media or YouTube?
Well, I was just, I don't know, this wouldn't necessarily go with that, but I was just going to say that I feel like a lot of people also have, the perception that just because an individual has depression means they also have, suicidal thoughts or something along those lines.
And the majority of people who experience depression and qualify for, not qualify, they hit the clinical criteria for either major depression or persistent depressive disorder. Most do not have suicidal thoughts. So you can meet all of the clinical criteria for depression and not have suicidal thoughts. Mm-hmm.
But you can just like make it go away instead of just learning how to fight through it.
Right, right. And frequently people think there's a quick fix. Something simple that the person can fix about their life or their thinking that'll turn it off. Right? So let's explore what researchers have found to be common misperceptions about depression. And I pulled from several internet sources. Some of them would be ones that I would, off the top declare inappropriate for your papers. But they did track back to original sources, so I went back to those to try and get a decently comprehensive list. Probably the one that comes to mind first for a lot of people is the idea of being told that your illness isn't real, that it's something that you've manufactured in your own head. Sometimes it's the idea of drama or attention seeking. And this is particularly true when you're talking about children and adolescents. It may surprise you that in the history of psychiatry, it wasn't until probably early 70s that it was agreed by mental health professionals that children could experience depression. Right? It was just assumed that children have no reason to be depressed, like ever. And if there were signs of depression in adolescence, it was just normal adolescent angst. So it could be ignored. Adults have depression, right? So that has had to be revised over the 20-some years, 30 years since then. So the realness of the illness, and that can be magnified by this idea of it's the common cold of mental illnesses. It's really not that serious. And it kind of comes packaged with this assumption that people will snap out of it at some point, right? There's also this misperception that people who have kind of good everyday lives, so they go to work, they go to school, they have interactions with other people, they occasionally are cheerful and engaged. There's an assumption that they aren't really depressed. So there's this stereotype that happy people who are engaging with their lives, can't be depressed is a really problematic one. For a lot of people who experience persistent depression, for example, they learn a coping strategy. And this is true of things like OCD, bipolar, and trauma disorders as well. You marshal all the resources to get through the day where you have to be with other people. And you pretend. You put on an act, you present your not depressed face to people, then you go home and you're done. Right? One of my kids has pretty profound ADHD. To get through school, she would put every ounce of energy and resource into focusing and paying attention and getting through class and getting work done. By the time she got home, she could not handle being in a room with another human being. It's the same for depression. So many times people with mental illnesses, particularly when they're persistent, they'll learn to pass. They'll pass as happy. So that they won't be exposed to someone saying, yeah, that's not a real thing, is it? Right? And I just saw you the other day, you were laughing and happy. How can you possibly be depressed? Right? So that one can be really painful and challenging for people. There's also a stereotype of laziness, and you mentioned that, that people are either lazy or they're weak or they're just not trying hard enough. Now, there are many, many mental illnesses, not just depression, where this idea of mental weakness, it comes into play. We'll certainly see it with the trauma disorders. And some of it is self-inflicted, believing I'm just not strong enough, I'm not focused enough, I'm not capable of doing this. So it can be sometimes a self-talk cycle of self-defeat. But also then there's the outsider's perspective that you're just not trying hard enough to feel good. Another tricky one is just linguistic. Clinically, depression and sadness are not the same thing. Everyone, no matter who they are, experiences sadness of one kind or another. Sadness is a normal human emotion. We all experience it. You've probably had episodes of sadness in the last week, perhaps more than once. Sadness is an emotion, tends to be state dependent. It also tends to be determined by the situations and experiences we're having at the moment. It can be intense, it can be painful, like the sadness associated with a loss of someone important to you or a thing that matters to you a great deal. That's normal mood. And it tends to be kind of self-correcting over time. People use their resources, they use their connections and their coping skills. Sadness tends to be resolved pretty naturally without intervention. Depression is a different animal, right? It's different typically in terms of the length of intensity. So it's intense and it may last longer. And in terms of the origin, where it's coming from, tends not to be as situationally based. There is an assumption, and this is certainly echoed in the film that we watched, that depression, particularly profound depressions that people have a great deal of difficulty arising out of, people are looking for a reason why. And this was another reason that mental health advocates were so opposed to 13 Reasons Why. And they started out opposed to the book on which it was based. And they went from there. We tend stereotypically to think to be depressed, there has to be a reason in someone's life. So, for example, if you see someone who's profoundly depressed, but their life has lots of positives, the stereotype is you have nothing to complain about. You have nothing to be sad about. Stop. Look at all the good things in your life. So one thing that people with depression often say is that it's really hurtful to them when other people, in the face of their sadness, their depression, point out all the great things in their life that they should be grateful for, right? And that can be really stabby. From personal experience, I had lots of relatives and friends when I was the sickest who would say, look at your life. Look at all the good things you've done. Look at all you've accomplished. Look at all these things. And I'm like, it's relevant. It doesn't mean anything. But it was a criticism, right? And that can make depression worse, to perceive that you're being criticized as irrational. There's an emerging, and this was something that came out of a study of YouTube videos. YouTube is a weird place and seems to get weirder all the time. Some researchers, they took a sampling of hundreds and hundreds of YouTube videos that were related to mental illness. And one of the things they found was that there was starting to be a wave during the time frame that they selected. So this was in the, I believe, between videos that were uploaded between 2014 and 2017, they started to see a mini wave of videos suggesting that the genetics of mental illness outweighed any other predictor. So they were starting to suggest if you have a parent or an aunt, an uncle, a sibling with a particular diagnosis, you're going to get it too, right? Now, this stereotype is twofold. On the one hand, you could be a person who has a family member with depression, and you may look at yourself and be fearful that you may develop the same problems. Or you could be in the other position. You're depressed, but you don't have a family history of it. And that stereotype can suggest if you don't have the family history, your depression isn't valid, right? So it can go in both directions. The genetic predictability for depression, and in your presentations you may touch on this, it's there. but it's not 100% reliable. It's a predictor, but it's not a terribly strong one. This is another thing that came out of the YouTube study, and it backs up other research on stereotypes about depression. And this kind of started at the very beginning of YouTube, in fact, where you had these contradictory postings of videos about medications. There's a whole kind of internet community that's anti-psychiatric medication. Just a huge culture of saying Big Pharma wants to kill you, and Big Pharma wants to addict you, and Big Pharma wants to replace your personality. And there's these videos that make outlandish claims, particularly about antidepressants. If you go looking for them, you'll find them. And some of them are just really outlandish in the misperceptions they have about science and the nature of how the brain works and how antidepressants work. So on the one hand, there's this push out there on the internet to say that taking medication is a bad thing, that it's you just falling prey to the whims of the big pharma industry who wants to take your money and enslave your mind, basically. Or they're going to turn you into a psycho killer. There's a whole genre of YouTube videos that hype this belief that there's a connection between taking SSRI, antidepressants, and school shooters. There's a whole subgenre out there that says Columbine would never have happened if those boys had not been on antidepressants. And there's like thousands of people who believe it's true, which is nonsense, but it's out there. Now, the other side of it is to say, and this also shows up as a subgenre on YouTube, that if you have depression, it is purely a biological problem. You must be on medication, and you must take medication for the rest of your life. So these are two very contradictory messages. They are confusing. Neither of them is accurate, right? For some people, medication is really valuable and important. For other people, medication is not the right choice. And for many, many people, medication is a temporary measure that helps them move through therapy, and then they no longer need it anymore. So whether you need medication or not, if you're a person with depression, is really an open conversation between you and your caregivers that you need to take a personal stake in deciding how to manage. And also at different points in your life, like I had to make this decision. If I want to have kids and I want to be pregnant, I need to stop taking medication while I'm doing that, right? There are risks involved in that, and that decision making needs to be done carefully, and it needs to be carefully managed. So those are things that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about these stereotypes. And, you know, I've noticed already, I don't have a lot of experience with TikTok because it's like this black hole of time that you just seem to fall down and never come back out of again, especially when they start showing me cute horses and stuff. But I've noticed, you know, following certain hashtags about mental health, you'll get these posts that people have, and it's about antidepressant medications, and half of them are like, they're horrible poison, don't do it, they don't do anything, they just take your money. And then others that are like, you have to take your medication and you have to take it forever. What both of those camps are missing is the valuable resource that is psychotherapy. So I already mentioned this one, the idea of being on antidepressants forever. Some of you mentioned the idea of just snapping out of it. For people who experience depression, you know, when they tell others, it's always a risky business. When I first started teaching this class, I didn't talk about my own personal experiences, in part because of the stigma that I was trying to teach about. I was still worried about it, and I had colleagues who, they knew my personal story, friends, and they were like, are you sure you want to disclose that to students? Will it affect your status? You know, your perception as being in charge of your classroom. And, for the first few years of teaching the class, I kind of bought into that stereotype and that mythology, but I decided the stakes were high enough that being honest about it was more useful. Part of why I was fearful of sharing my own story for as long as was the case was the tendency I had experienced in other people of thinking that, it'll pass. You need to snap out of it. Have you heard the phrase, fake it until you make it? I really hate that one when applied to mental illness. So I have been passing my entire life, day to day, to get through the day. Being a successful student. Faking it didn't work, and I knew it. But other people were telling me that snap out of it, faking it until you make it actually does work, when it doesn't, right? So I had a particularly negative reaction to being exposed to that stereotype. There's also a stereotype that's really dangerous. If you look at the statistics of mortality associated with depression, the most likely cohort within American culture to actually die by suicide is men over the age of 50. That is the highest percentage of people who die by suicide. And the overwhelming majority of those individuals also have symptoms consistent with a diagnosis of depression, along with other things in their lives. So when you think of that, that flies in the face of the stereotype. Now, historically, here's part of the problem. Gender roles in Western culture do suggest men are strong, men are powerful, men are in charge, including in charge of their minds and their emotions. There's this narrow bandwidth of emotionality that's seen as permissible for males. Anger's okay. In fact, it's valid. It's valued. Happiness is okay. Joy's okay. Anger's super okay, especially in competitive environments. Sadness and fear, not okay. Right? I remember thinking when my kids were playing youth soccer, neither of them were particularly talented at it, especially when they were little. Like 6-year-olds playing soccer, it's like swarm ball. And everybody's falling down. Some of them are picking flowers. The one thing that was crystal clear, I was sitting on the sidelines with my snacks, waiting for the kids to be done, and I would see, a little boy would fall over. No one would rush onto the field. He could be crying, and what people would shout, that it didn't matter if it was moms or dads, just get up, get back in there, you're fine. You're fine, right? Little girl would fall over and start to cry. Coach would go out, pick them up, hand them to their parents, right? So the expectations are pretty clear about what's assumed to be normative. You need to shape and train those boys not to cry when they're hurt and not to express their fear. They're to be brave, they're to be strong. And that's built into this stereotypic assumption that depression isn't a thing that men have. So diagnostically, I wish I could find the original research. I haven't been able to put my finger on it. It was something that one of my professors in grad school shared with us in class. They really looked at diagnostic patterns, and they compared the ultimate diagnosis that men and women got for having the same symptoms. And when you look at people with basic depressive symptoms, the women overwhelmingly got the diagnosis of depression. Overwhelmingly. The men, and this was regardless of how much alcohol was being consumed by both groups, the men got a primary diagnosis of substance abuse, not depression. So the women get the depression diagnosis. Their substance abuse is ignored, just depression. The men get the substance abuse diagnosis. Their depression is ignored, right? And in the medical community and the mental health community, treatment, they're different worlds. Substance abuse and mental health. Until relatively recently, they were completely separate government entities for controlling the funding of treatment for substance abuse and mental illness. And that comes from this bifurcation of believing they're completely separate things, right? So gender matters there. The assumption that men can't get depressed or that they shouldn't get depressed leads to it's not real for you. You can't be depressed, you're a guy. It leads to, you have all these good things in your life. You're supposed to be strong. People who are depressed are weak, or they're feminine. So historically, if you go back and look at the psychoanalytic argument for depression, if men were depressed, they were sexually confused, and they were likely homosexual. There's an accusation for you, right? So again, we're talking about the period between 1915 and 1940, which was the heyday of psychoanalysis. Being a male trying to go to an analyst and primarily with depressive symptoms was super risky. Number one, the analyst is going to blame your mom. Number two, going to blame your mom for being too sexually interested in you. And number three, that confuses you sexually, and you might be thinking you're attracted to men, and then now obviously you're depressed, right? So the history of psychology has tended to make it to stack the deck against men being able to go to a therapist and get competent treatment for depression. Luckily, that has changed, and now that we have more balance in the types of approaches that are being taken, people can actually get treatment simultaneously for substance abuse and for depression, which matters. The other part with masculinity, we tend to assume that for men, there has to be an external factor. There has to be an initiating event that causes the depression to occur. We're a bit more comfortable with females being able to just kind of say, I'm depressed. There's an expectation in the medical community and in the psychiatric community, historically, to assume that women are just, because of their hormones, more prone to depression, period. Men, not so much. Like somehow testosterone is a protective factor. Which, if you really look at the biology, estrogen is a happy drug. Estrogen tends to be associated with improved mood, whereas excessive amounts of testosterone, opposite. So if you really want to think about it hard, you can remember that. There's also an assumption that, and this, if you remember back to Girl Interrupted, when Susanna's with her boyfriend, they're in bed, and she's talking about death, and he's like, stop talking about it. That echoes this, this stereotype. There's this assumption, and this is primarily, hey, no, down. In Western culture, there's an assumption that your pain and suffering, and this is largely a historical thing, in your lifetimes, this has not been as powerful. But if I like to take the long view. So if I go back to my parents' generation, so my mother's 84, her generation, you did not air your emotional life to anyone. It's your emotional life. You do not air it to anyone. It's private, it's personal, and anyway, dwelling on bad feelings, dwelling on emotion that is unpleasant, just makes it worse. Now, it's not completely peculiar to American culture, but it's very strong in American culture, particularly in white American culture. there's also been research on cultural groupings within the United States where it's even stronger. This tendency to say you don't talk about emotions because it will amplify them. Negative emotions in particular, sadness even more so. So there's a stereotype that, really just digging around in your depression, talking about it to people is going to reinforce the depression and make it worse. So that statement that Susanna's boyfriend makes, that Toby makes in the film, is, don't talk about it, it's stupid. That's something that a lot of people with depression have been told in one way or another. That if you dwell on these negative feelings and you talk about them a lot, it's going to amplify them and keep you committed to them. So there's also, it connects to the attention seeking in the drama. Sometimes, especially for adolescents, when they share their depression, they share the degree to which they are suffering. There are some people, sometimes it's their peers, sometimes it's their parents, and other people around them will say, this is just normal adolescent attention seeking and drama. And if I indulge it, it will make it worse. So a lot of adolescents experiencing depression report that someone in their sphere that they first told that they were experiencing these really intense emotions literally told them, you know what, just put it out of your mind. If you indulge those thoughts, you're just going to keep going back to them. And they reported that, every time they tried to start the conversation, that the person they were talking to would shut them down. And it was almost as if they were trying to retrain them and condition them, like training a dog to stop doing something. They were trying to condition them by walking away when they opened the conversation. And part of what researchers have found is that there is a correlation between exhibiting that behavior of walking away from someone's statements about depression and their belief that talking about it will make it worse. Right? And that leads straight into the last one that I found just looking at the literature. And that is the idea that talk therapy doesn't do anything. For your generation, no. You get so bored. I know. For your generation in particular, you've never known a time where there weren't ads for meds on TV or all over the internet. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, did not approve television or other media advertising for psychotropic medications until 1991, maybe 1990. You can fact check me on that, but it's right about there. Because I was in grad school when the first Prozac ads came out. That was one of the first wave of SSRIs, and the ads had a little round guy, shaped like a pill, little animated round guy, and he danced across the screen. Happy pill, right? Boing, 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 boing. And he turns from a frowny faced little sad guy to a happy little sad little guy. I remember the ad very, very carefully. And the original ads, they didn't come, you know how ads these days for some medications, you get to the end where they start talking really fast about the really bad things that can happen when you take this medication, like including death. They didn't have to do that at first. It's just, here's all the great things this medication can do for you. Make sure you ask your doctor about Prozac. And yeah, not surprisingly, a lot of people went to their doctor and said, hey, can I have some Prozac? Boom. Lots of profits right away. So your generation, you've never known a world where there wasn't advertising for medications for mental illnesses of various kinds. You can find them all over the place. So what you don't see ads for? Psychotherapy. I can't remember the last time I saw an ad for just straight up psychotherapy. Like CBT, it's great for you. Now, number one, there isn't like an entity that is marketing cognitive and behavioral therapy for depression that can profit from doing so, say, during the Super Bowl. There's no one entity that can do that. You will occasionally see, depending on what networks you frequent, whether there are advertisements or not. I'm in a demographic where I see a lot of advertisements for, things that help men of a certain age continue to perform sexually. But I also see a lot of advertisements directed at women of a certain age to help them combat depression associated with hormonal changes or menopause. I also get a lot of advertisements for other kinds of medications, for other kinds of conditions, based on my demographics on Facebook, Instagram, and so on. The only type of therapy I get ads for is for substance abuse. Those tend to be for-profit clinics where people will pay tens of thousands of dollars a month. Yeah.
I've seen ads now for there's this online therapy thing that's called it's called
BetterHelp. Yeah.
So I see that a lot.
For-profit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a shift. So I was going to go there next. Online psychotherapy is a very high profit area of growth. BetterHelp is one. There are probably two other major players in that space. And they've got some pretty high profile celebrities on board. Like Michael Phelps is associated with BetterHelp. And one of the challenges that mental health advocates are facing with the BetterHelp kind of model is the question of the degree to which the professionals that are providing services are actually able to and are prepared to provide services for people with serious problems, with problems that might put them in jeopardy. So there are some pretty profound challenges with delivering services online. That is pretty much the only sphere where we're seeing direct advertising to consumers talking about psychotherapy. Some of the dangerous ones that are out there, online marketing for therapy services, are smaller, less likely to be accredited, and they're a bit predatory. They're about very specific areas of diagnosis, and you need to exhibit some real care and concern. So like with BetterHelp, they have affiliations with national organizations that are going to do some accrediting oversight. Some of the other organizations that are for-profit, they aren't going to do that. They're strictly out to sign you up, get you in a subscription, and hope to maintain you as a client. So that's tricky. That's difficult. Some of the other services you should be aware of are prescription mills. There are, and the federal government is now getting involved in trying to get some oversight and control over them. There are a handful of companies that have launched nationwide. I've stopped seeing the ads, so I think the feds have put the lockdown on them for a while. They may come back, but about 5 years ago, I started seeing ads for you can get your psychiatric medications without having to find a psychiatrist in your area. So basically, you become a member, so you pay a subscription fee, you get access to a psychiatrist who will write you a script for ADHD meds with the primary. One of these companies is called Cerebral. Be very careful with Cerebral. You do not necessarily have your best interests at heart. But it was designed to be a way for people to circumvent the diagnostic system, to get a quick diagnosis of ADHD, and to get amphetamines. What the feds got worried about was a lot of the people who were subscribing were actually getting prescriptions and selling them. And a lot of it was happening on college campuses. So essentially, Cerebral was a great big drug dealer. So that's one of the difficulties. Now, from a stereotype standpoint, there is still, even though lots of people go to psychotherapy, lots of people understand it, they know what it is, and for many people it's been very, very helpful. There's still a tendency for people to be suspicious that therapy is ineffective. And part of that is because of the media that we're exposed to. So just to pull some threads together here, online stereotypes that we can find can make things worse. I mentioned that popular messages on YouTube really push some misconceptions about depression that are problematic. Like one really popular one that keeps popping up as an ad on my YouTube feed, because that's where my video lectures go, is YouTube. So sometimes I'll see these. They're pushing nutritional supplements as a non-prescription solution to depression, and they make the argument directly that nutraceuticals are the natural solution to your depression. They're more effective than other kinds of treatments. Don't buy the big pharma argument. Take this vitamin supplement or whatever. And there are other similar kinds of misconceptions. There's also competing messaging through fictional stories that can either downplay the severity of depression or over-associate it with suicide, neither of which is accurate, and both are problematic. There's also a problem with, in the YouTube study that I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a division. Some videos really push the experience situational argument, and a lot of those are videos that are oriented toward a male audience. Some of them really push the biological disease argument, and those tend to be slightly more oriented toward women as an audience. The fact of the matter, depression is tied to both situational and organic causes. YouTube videos do tend, on average, to suggest that depression is permanent, and therefore the message underlying it is that recovery is unlikely and not going to last. So that's actually flies in the face of the research. Most people recover, and most people do not have remitting depression. YouTube also tends to throw a whole lot of quick fixes. Can you think of some of the quick fixes that are proposed for depression that you might have run across? Oh, yeah. Now, there is a kernel of truth, right? For many people with depression, physical activity is a useful way of helping to combat depressive symptoms. It, however, is not the solution. It's not, a holistic solution to depressive illness. It's helpful as a coping strategy. It's not going to fix it. So a lot of messaging about exercise. A lot of people want you to do yoga. I love yoga, although it makes my toes cramp. But yoga is not a panacea for depression. Other quick fixes you've seen? Yeah, and that's a real double-edged one, right? It means, okay, so I'm depressed because my friend group isn't good enough, right? I need to get better friends. I need a better support. I need to train my friends to be a better support system. Or maybe there's something wrong with my family, that they did something wrong to me. Yeah.
Diet.
Yeah, a lot on diet. I ran just last night. I was looking for something specific on YouTube and I wasn't finding it. I wanted to use it in another class. And one of the videos that came up was about how you can build an antidepressant diet. I was like, okay, are there lots of blueberries? Because that would be great. And when I watched part of it, it was all about antioxidants and You know, I'm all in favor of good nutrition. Nutrition is awesome. I know of no clinical study that shows that antioxidants have any impact on depression at all. Now, if by blood test, you are deficient in vitamin D, that will make you depressed. And getting your vitamin D back where it belongs will alleviate your symptoms. But unless you have a vitamin deficiency or a thyroid deficiency, diet's unlikely to improve the situation within, certain boundaries. There is a mild association between the inflammation that comes from certain kind of diets, like high-fat diets that are not, that don't have enough protein and enough nutritional diversity, can cause bodily inflammation. Body-level inflammation can increase vulnerability to depression. So there's a kernel of truth to the diet thing, but diet alone is typically not going to be a good prediction of successfully remitting depression. Other quick fixes you've been exposed to? You just need to get a good night's sleep. Yeah, there's that just again. Sleep matters, and you will often hear doctors and mental health professionals encourage people to adopt good sleep hygiene. I don't know why it's hygiene. What is it about it being clean? Anyway, they want you to have good sleep habits. So it is true that insomnia can be a problem for depressed people. So can hypersomnia, too much sleep. So sleep as a panacea just doesn't work. Sleep is often a symptom of depression rather than a solution. Now, what can you do with this information, all of these myths and things to keep an eye on? Number one, being aware of them can be very helpful. Knowing what the stereotypes are can help you, like if you experience depression, it can help you to know what the stereotypes are, so when you hear them reflected at you, you can go, that's a stereotype, I'm not letting you in. Or you can combat it. You can go directly at it and say, that's not true. Here's what's true. Don't throw that stuff at me, right? So you can protect yourself. Or if you have a friend or family member who is experiencing depression, it can help you know what might be hurtful to say. So to avoid espousing those stereotypes and be a person who can be genuinely supportive as opposed to saying things that are damaging. Okay? Questions? All right. Get me your stuff. Okay? All right. See you all on Friday.
That would have been so embarrassing.